The Shame Dance by Wilbur Daniel Steele. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Shame Dance. From The Best Short Stories of 1921 and the Yearbook of the American Short Story. Stories of New York life preferable. Well then, here is a story of New York. A tale of the night heart of the city, where the vein of 42nd touches the artery of Broadway, where, amid the constellations of chewing gum ads and toothpaste and memory methods, rise the incandescent facades of dancing academies with their 60 instructresses, their beat of brass and strings, their whisper of feet, their clink of dimes. Let a man not work away his strength and his youth. Let him breathe a new melody, let him draw out of imagination a novel step, a more fantastic tilt of the pelvis, a wilder gesticulation of the deltoid. Let him put out his hand to the touch of gold. It is a tale of this New York. That it didn't chance to happen in New York is beside the point. Where? It wouldn't help you much if I told you. Taai, that island. Take an imaginary ramrod into Times Square, push it straight down through the center of the earth. Where it comes out on the other side will not be very many thousand miles wide of that earth speck in the South Seas. Some thousands, yes. But out here a few thousand miles and a month or so by schooner make less difference than they do where the trains run under the ground. Glauber's Academy, Einstein's Restaurant, Herald Square. I can't tell you how bizarrely those half-fabulous names fell from Signet's lips in the turquoise and gold of the afternoon. It was like the babble of some monstrous and harmless mythology. And all the while, as he kicked his bare heels on the deck-house and harassed me with his somnolent greed for talk, one could see him wondering, in the back of his mind. So he would have been wondering through all the hours of weeks, months. It had come to the dignity of years, on the beach in the bush, wondering more than ever under the red iron roof of the Dutchman. What in hell am I doing here? What in hell? A gutter snipe, pure and simple. That's to say, impure and unpleasantly complex. It was extraordinary how it struck, even with nothing on but a pair of cotton pants swimming out to me among the flashing bodies of the islanders, men, women, girls, youths, who clung to the anchor cable and showed their white teeth for pilot biscuit, condensed milk, and gin, especially gin. Even there you could see Signet, an imagination, dodging through the traffic on 7th Avenue to pick the telegraph racing chart out of the rubbish can under the elevated. I hadn't an idea who the fellow was. He burst upon me unheralded. I sail out of West Coast ports, but once I had been in New York. That was enough for him. He was pals in 10 minutes. In 15, from his eminence on the deck-house, with a biscuit in one hand and a tumbler of much-diluted Hollands in the other, he gazed down at his erstwhile beach-fellows with almost the disdainful wonder of a tourist from a white ship's rail. "Gimme an article you can retail at a nickel. Any little thing everybody needs. Or gimme a song with a catchy chorus, something you can turn out on them 10-cent records. That makes me. Don't want any Wall Street stuff. That's for Rockefeller and the boobs. But just one time lemme catch on with one little old hunch that'll go in vaudeville or the pictures. Get Smith and Jones digging for the old nickel. That makes me. Then the line can move up one. That's the thing about New York. Say, man, lend me a cigarette. But that's the thing about Broadway. When you make big. I know a guy turned out of a powder puff looked like a lorgnette. $0.25. You know how the Janes'll fall for a thing like that." It was completely preposterous, almost uncomfortable. It made a man look around him. On the schooner's port side spread the empty blue of the South Pacific, the tenuous snowdrift of the reef, far out, and the horizon. On the starboard hand, beyond the little space of the anchorage, curved the beach, a pink-white scimitar laid flat. Then the scattering of thatched and stilted huts, the red corrugated iron store, residence, and godowns of the Dutch trader, the endless Indian file of cocoa palms, the abrupt green wall of the mountain. A 12-year-old girl, naked as Eve, and, I've no doubt, thrice as handsome, stood watching us from the mid-decks in a perfection of immobility, an empty milk tin propped between her brown palms, resting on her breast. 20 fathoms off, a shark fin, blue as lapis on the shadow, cut the water soundlessly. The hush of 10,000 miles was disturbed by nothing but that grotesque, microscopic babbling. Say you play in bad luck. Well, you can't play in bad luck forever. Not if you're wise. One time I get 5 good wheezes, good ones, sure fire. One of them was the old one about the mother-in-law and the doctor. Only it had a perfectly novel turn to it. Did I make? I did not. Why? Well, a good friend of mine lifts them 5 wheezes, writes a vaudeville turn around them, and makes big. Big. What does that learn me? Learns me to go bare on friendship, so next time I get an idea. The girl had put the milk tin down between her toes on deck, and turned her head. "Digger," I called to the mate, "clear the vessel. Shove them all overboard. Here comes the Dutchman." Before the advance of the trader's canoe, painted vermilion like his establishment, and flying over the water under the paddle-strokes of his 6 men, Signet took himself hastily overboard with the rest. There was no question of protest or false pride. Over he went, rising and treading water under the taffrail, and seeing the trader still some fathoms off, he shook the wet from the rag of a beard with which long want of a razor had blurred his peaked chin, and gathered up the ends of the conversation. "No, Dol, you can't play in bad luck forever. One sure finds hunch, that's all. That makes me. When I go back to Broadway—" A paddle-blade narrowly missed his head. He dived. The Dutchman told me more about him that evening. I dined at the trader's house. He was a big-bodied, tow-haired man who spoke English with the accent of a south-east Scot, drank like a Swede, and viewed life through the eyes of a Spaniard. That is, he could be diabolical without getting red in the face. "No, my dear sir, that Signet shall not get back to Broadway. Too many I have seen. He is too tired, quite too tired." "But how in the world did he ever come here, mynheer?" "That is simple. This Signet got drunk in Papeete. He was on his way to Australia with a pugilist. How should he be in a pugilist's company, this crab? Because he plays a good game of pinochle to keep the pugilist's mind bright. At any rate, the steamship stops in Tahiti. This Signet gets drunk, soused, and the steamship is gone without him. No more pinochle for the pugilist, what? From then, my dear sir, it is what it shall always be. One island throws him to another island. Here he shall stay for a while." "Till you decide to throw him to another island, eh, mynheer?" "No, but I am alone. Sometimes to amuse myself I will invite him to dine with me. I put on him a suit of the evening clothes which belonged to my nephew who is dead, but I will not allow him the razor, since his absurd beard is amusing to me. Afterward, however, I take away the evening clothes, and I will kick him out. But he is talking continuously." "I believe you, mynheer." "But at last I will say, 'My dear sir, I suppose that you shall have the most brilliant idea, that hunch of yours. Sure fire. What advantage will it do you here in the island of Taai? You are not here on Broadway. You are too many thousand miles. You cannot come here. You are too tired. It takes money. Now, my dear sir, I am putting a trench about the godowns. If you wish, I will let you work for me.'" "What does he say to that, mynheer?" "He says, 'Do you take me for an Italian?' Then I will say, 'No, you see you are too tired. Also you are too soft. You are a criminal, that's natural to you. But you think of police. You have a wish, say. Well, my dear sir, but would you kill a man, 3, 10 men, to have that wish? No, you are too tired, and you must have the police. But here there are no police. I am the police. Why do you not kill me? Ha, ha, ha! Then you could take my property. Then you would make big, as you say. My dear sir, that is a hunch. That is sure fire. Ha, ha, ha! Then I will kick him out in his coolie cotton pants." After coffee the trader said, 1 gallon of the Hollands which you sent me ashore has disappeared. The kitchen boys are careless. Also, I wink one eye when a schooner arrives. Of course they will dance tonight, however. You would care to go up, my dear sir?" Of course we went. There's no other amusement on an islet like Taai but the interminable native dance. The Dutchman led the way up a narrow, bushy ravine, guiding me by sound rather than by sight. "Up this same very path," I heard him, "has gone one uncle of mine. They pulled him to the advance with one rope around his arms. Then they cut him up and ate him. But that was many years ago, my dear sir. Now I am the law. Maybe there shall come, now and then, a Dutch gunboat to have a look in. I raise up the flag. The captain shall dine with me. All is good. But, my dear sir, I am the law." The music began to be heard, a measured monotone of drums, a breath of voices in a recitative chant, slightly impassioned by that vanished gallon. The same old thing, indeed, one of the more than 57 varieties of the island hula. Then that had died away. The light from the place grew among the higher leaves, and the trader, becoming visible, halted. I saw him standing, listening. "No, my dear sir, but that is a new thing." He started forward. He stopped again. I heard it now. Out of the familiar, hollow tautophony of drum beats there began to emerge a thread of actual melody, of untraditional rise and fall of notes, a tentative attack, as it were, on the chromatic scale of the West. No he-goat skin stretched on bamboo would do that. We pushed on, curious. We came out into the place. The scene under the candle-nut torches was as familiar to us as the Ohio River of Uncle Tom to the small-town schoolboy. The meagre rows of three-quarter naked Kanakas, yellow with saffron and blue with Tatua's ink. The old women in the background of sultry lights and enormous shadows compounding endless balls of popoi for the feast. The local and decepted chieftain squatting on his hams and guarding the vanished gallon between his knees. This was all as it should have been. This was the convention. But what was really happening on that sylvan, torchlit stage that night was something as new as anything can be under the sun, because it was something that had not happened for 10,000 years. We who are worn with novelty can never reconquer for ourselves the thrill of an unmitigated wonder. We have sold the birthright, but imagine the toppling of 100 centuries. You could have seen it in the eyes of those watchers, in their rapt, rapacious attention, in the conflict that went on within them visibly, traitorous applause pent and pitted against all the instinctive protest of an established art. "Yes, but this isn't dancing." Yet their bodies, one here, one there, would begin to sway. 3 Kanaka men, strangers to the island, sat cross-legged on the turf. One had taken over a drum from a local musician. The other 2 had instruments fashioned of dried gourds with fingering pieces of bamboo and strings of gut, barbaric cousins to the mandolin. So, on this one night in history, the music of another tribe had come to Taai. It just escaped being an authentic tune. How it escaped was indefinable. The sophisticated ear would almost have it, and abruptly it had got away in some provoking lapse, some sudden and bizarre disintegration of tone. And the drum-beat, bringing it back, ran like a fever-pulse in a man's blood. In the centre of the sward, her back to the musicians, a solitary female danced, a Kanaka woman, clothed in a single shift of the sheerest crimson cotton, tied at one shoulder and falling to mid-thigh. Not from Taai did this woman come, one saw that, not from any near island or group. Her beauty was extraordinary, like that of the Marquesans, with that peculiar straightness of all the lines, at once Grecian, austere, and incalculably voluptuous. The dance, as I saw it for the first time that night, I will not speak of. I have traded to many islands in many groups, even the low archipelago, but the island where that dance was indigenous I am sure I've never touched. Compared with any of the hulas, set and fixed in each locality as the rites of Rome, it was sophisticated. It gave an illusion of continuous invention and spontaneity. It was flesh swept by a wind and shattered. It ravished the eyes. I don't know how long I watched, how long all the immortal flame in me lent itself to the histrionic purposes of that woman, but I shall never forget it. Never, never. I looked away. I saw two faces. One of them hung over my shoulder. It was the trader's. It was the face of a man who has lived a very long while wielding power of life and death over unsatisfying satisfactions. A man awakened. The toppling of 100 centuries indeed. The other was Signet's, scarred by leaf shadows, thrust like a swimmer's from the meagre sea of heads and naked shoulders it held as still as a death mask, minute by minute, except that, in the penumbra cast by the veil of goat tuft on his chin, the Adam's apple was convulsed at intervals as if he were swallowing, as if the man were drinking. The night grew, the torches were consumed, the place deserted. Somewhere the amazing voyagers had taken themselves to rest. A half-moon mutilated the island, long stripes of palms, shadow scars of defiles, mottles of bushes. It was like a sleeping animal, a tiger of deep blue and blue-white, an enormous leopard. We sat on the veranda at the residence, the trader and I. By and by, soft-footed, Signet was there, occupying the lowermost step. The Dutchman talked. Like the able administrator he was, he had already all the data to be procured. Into his ears had poured the whispered trickles of a score of informants. "You are right, my dear sir. Marquesan. You have been there?" "No. She is called in Polynesian Queen Daughter. My people, who know nothing as a rule, of course, but they tell me the woman is in actuality the daughter of a queen. But what is a Kanaka queen? After all, Signet, my dear sir, down there, what is one queen out here?" The trader was obviously in a good humour. He had not been excited for years. The man was alive. I've said he was like a Spaniard in that he could be diabolical without getting red in the face. Diabolically devious and strategic. Before he resumed he blew 3 mouthfuls of cigar smoke out into the moonlight, where they burst from the shadow under the roof like mute cannon shots, round and silvery. Beneath them, from the step, Signet's eyes were fixed upon the trader's face, dry, rapt, glazed with some imperious preoccupation. "But they tell me this woman has danced in a great many islands. She will go from here to another island to dance. The 3 men are her husbands, but she has no wife. A maid, that woman. They have the hardihood to tell me that. Ha, ha, ha! But then she is daughter to a queen. With those husbands she crosses 100 leagues of sea in her sailing canoe, that royal canoe, to dance at another island." As the Dutchman talked, blowing his smoke bursts into the moonlight, the vision of that Marquesan woman came again before me. I perceived her, under the heavy procession of his words, a figure of astounding romance, an adventuress incomparable, a Polynesian bacchante. No, I saw her as the missionary of a strange thing, crossing oceans, daring thirst and gale and teeth of sharks, harrying deeper and deeper into the outseas of mystery that small, devoted, polyandrous company of husbands, at once her paddlers, cooks, flunkies, watchdogs, music-makers. Queen Daughter, royal and self-anointed priestess of that unheard-of dance, the tribal dance, no doubt, of some tiny principality rearing a cone in the empty hugeness of the sea. I couldn't get away from my time and race. I found myself wondering what she got out of it, in some jungle-bowered, torch-lit high place, to feel again the toppling of 10,000 years. Was it something to feel the voluptuous and abominable beauty of that rhythm going out of her flesh, beat by beat, and entering into the flesh of those astounded and half-hostile watchers? Perhaps. They tell me that she has also danced at Papeete, before the white men of the steamships, the Dutchman was informing us. At that, from the step, from the moon-blue huddle of the castaway, there came a sound. With a singular clarity of divination I built up the thought, the doubt, the bitter perturbation in the fellow's mind. The woman had danced then at Papeete, the crossroads, the little Paris of mid-seas, and before the white men from steamers, the white men that go back. Moved by projects deeper and more devious than ours, The Dutchman made haste to cover up what seemed to have been an overshot. Frankly, he turned his attention to the outcast. "By the God, then, my dear Signet, have you considered?" He knew well enough that Signet had considered. He could see as well as I that Signet was a changed man. But he must pile it on. "There, my dear sir, you have it. That hunch, that sure fire. Do you think I do not know that New York of yours? Such a dance as that! You must believe me. If you were but a man of energy, now—" With the utmost deliberation he launched upon a tirade of abuse. "But no, you are not a man of energy, not a man to take things in your hands. The obstacles are too big. Those 3 husbands. You might even take that woman, that lovely, royal dancing woman. You, my dear sir, a common street snipe. What would a woman like that, with that novel, impassioned, barbaric foreign dance, be worth to a man on your Broadway, eh? But obstacles, obstacles. You have her not on Broadway. It is too many thousand miles, and you have no money. But see, if you were a man to grasp things, a man to hit the nail on the head, to boost, to go big, then would not a man like me, who turns everything to gold, would he not say to you quickly enough, 'See here, my dear sir, but let me put so much money into your undertaking myself'?" Under the explosions of cigar smoke, Signet continued to hold the trader with his eyes, seemed to consume him with the fixed dry fire of his gaze, not fathoming, as with a singular intuition I had fathomed, the profound purposes of the Dutchman. Signet saw only the implied promise in his words. The trader broke out once more with a sardonic and calculated spleen. "But no, obstacles. A snivelling little animal sees only obstacles. The obstacle not to be mounted over, those 3 husbands. There they lie to-night on Nakokai's platform. This beautiful, incredible queen daughter, this gold goddess of the shame dance, and about her those 3 husbands. Ah, my dear sir, but their big, lithe muscles, that is too much. To imagine them leaping up at the alarm in the moonlight, the overpowering and faithful husbands. No, he cannot put out his hand to take the gift. Pah! He is a criminal in nature, but he is afraid of the police, even here. He is not a man for the big life in these islands. He will never do anything. Those faithful, strong watch-dogs of husbands, those strong, destructive muscles. Dear, good God, that is too much to think of. Look, my dear sir." He was speaking to me as if Signet were less than the very pebbles at the step. He got up, striking the floor heavily with his boots, and I followed him into the house, where he took a lighted candle from a stand. Buried in our shadows, silent-footed, Signet pursued us as the trader had meant him to do. I persist in saying that I perceived the sure thing as a whole. From the first I had divined the manoeuvre of the Dutchman. "Look," he repeated, flinging open the door and thrusting in the candle to cast its light over ranks and ranges of metal. It was the gun-room of the residence. Here dwelt the law. Shotguns, repeating rifles, old-style revolvers, new, blue automatics, an arsenal. "Big brown muscles," he cried, with a ponderous disdain. "What are they? What is the strongest brown man? Puff! To a man of purpose and indomitable will like me. Obstacles? 3 husbands? Puff, 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 like that. But all that will never be of use to him, that Signet. No, he is a street snipe who will steal a pocket-book and call it a crime. He is afraid to grasp. But it is close in here, is it not?" It was too bold. He stepped across the floor, unlatched and threw open the blind of the window, letting the candle-light stream forth upon a mass of bougainvillea vine without. "I keep this door locked. You can imagine that." He laughed, returning and shutting us out of the gun-room. He twisted the key, put it in his pocket, and there at the back that window blind stood open. He stared at Signet as if the beachcomber were just discovered. "You are hopeless, my dear sir." "Let us have a drink." He shifted. For Signet he poured a tumblerful of raw gin. The fellow took it like a man in a daze, the daze of a slowly and fiercely solidifying resolution. It shivered in his hand. A habit of greed sucked his lips. Into his mouth he took a gulp of the spirits. He held it there. His eyes searched our faces with a kind of malignant defiance. Of a sudden he spat the stuff out, right on the floor. He said nothing. It was as if he said, "By God, if you think I need that! No, you don't know me." He stalked out of the door. When we followed as far as the veranda, we saw him making off into the striped light to the left. "Why did you call it the shame dance, mynheer?" We were seated again. "Of course, my dear sir, it is not that, but it has a sound so when the Kanakas speak it. The woman spoke the name. If it is a Polynesian word, I have not heard it before. Shemdance, like that." "A good name, though. By jingo, a darn good name, eh, mynheer?" But the trader's head was turned in an attitude of listening, triumphant listening, at the keyhole of the striped moonlit night. I heard it too, a faint disturbance of bougainvillea foliage around two sides of the house, near the window standing open to the gun-room. Of course the amazing thing was that the man fooled us. In the Dutchman's heart, I believe, there was nothing but astonishment at his own success. Signet, on the face of it, was the typical big talker and little doer, a flaw in character which one tends to think imperishable. He fitted so precisely into a certain pigeon-hole of humankind. What we had not counted on was the fierceness of the stimulus, like the taste of blood to a carnivore, or, to the true knight, a glimpse of the veritable Grail. All the following day I spent on board, overseeing the 100 minor patchings and caulkings a South Sea trader will want in port. When I went ashore that evening after sundown, I found the Dutchman sitting in the same chair on the veranda, blowing smoke out into the afterglow. There was the illusion of perfect continuity with the past. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. Life flowed like a sleeping river, it would seem. But this was the status of affairs. The 3 brown music-makers, sons-in-law to an island queen, lay on a platform somewhere within the edge of the bush, heavier by ounces with 32-caliber slugs, awaiting burial. And Signet, gutter-snipe, beachcomber, and midnight assassin was lodged in the calaboose, built stoutly in a corner of the biggest and reddest of the Dutchman's go-downs. As for the royal dancing-woman, I was presently, in the trader's phrase, to have a look at her. At his solicitation I followed around the house, past the gun-room window, locked fast enough now, you may be sure, and up steeply through a hedged, immaculate garden, which witnessed to the ordered quality of the owner's mind. At the upper end, under a wall of volcanic tufa, we came to a summer-house done in the native style, stilts below, palmite thatch above, and walled on 3 sides only with hanging screens of bamboo. Striking through this screen from the west, the rose and green of the afterglow showed the woman as in a semi-luminous cavern, seated cross-legged in the centre of the platform, her hands drooped between her knees, and her large dark eyes fixed upon the sea beyond the roof of the residence below. Was it the perfect immobility of defiance and disdain? Not once did her transfixed gaze take us in. Was it the quiescence of defeat and despair, that level brooding over the ocean which had been to her, first and last, a cradle and roadway for her far, adventurous pilgrimages? She sat there, before our peering eyes, the sudden widow, the daughter of potentates brought low, the goddess of an exuberant and passionate vitality struck with quietude, mute, astounded by catastrophe, yet unbowed. The beauty of that golden-skinned woman abashed me. It did not abash the Dutchman. His was another and more indomitable fibre. It is fine to succeed, beyond expectation, detail by detail of strategy. His hands were clean. He remained the perfect administrator. Had there been no other way, he would not have flinched at any necessary lengths of wholesale or retail butchery. Still, it was nice to think that his hands were spotless. For instance, if that gunboat, with its purple Amsterdammer of a captain, should just now happen in. His face glowed in the dusk, his eyes shone with frank calculations. Fists on hips, head thrust out, one saw him casting up the sum of his treasure-trove. But he was an epicure. He could wait. It was even delightful to wait. When I turned away, he came down with me, his hands still on his hips and his eyes on the gently emerging stars. The man was extraordinary. Sitting on the veranda, bombarding the direction of the foreshore with that huge deliberate fusillade of cigar-smoke, he talked of home, of his boyhood on the dyke at Volendam, and of his mother, who, bless her, was still alive to send him cheeses at Christmas time. It was midnight, and the moon was rising when I got away and moved down toward the beach where the dinghy waited. The horizontal rays struck through the grating of the calaboose at the corner of the go-down I was skirting. I saw the prisoner. The upright shadow of an iron bar cut his face in two, separating the high, soiled cheeks, each with an eye. "You mustn't leave him get at her." I tell you, it was not the same man that had come swimming and snivelling out of the schooner less than 40 hours before. Here was a fierce one, a zealot, a flame, the very thin blade of a fine sword. "Listen, Dole, if you leave that devil get at her." His eyes burned through me. He failed completely to accept the fact that he was done. His mind, ignoring the present, ran months ahead, with a flare of understanding, thinking of those 3 travesties of husbands and the wife who was no wife. I perceived what he meant. I left him. He was a wild man, but the quality of his wildness showed himself in the fact that he squandered none of it in shaking the bars, shouting, or flinging about. His voice to the last, trailing me around the next corner, held to the same key, almost subdued. "By God, if that gets at her, I'll—" "You'll what?" I mused. You see, even now I couldn't get rid of him as the drifter, the gutter Hamlet, the congenital howler against fate. "You'll what?" I repeated under my breath, and I had to laugh. I got the vessel under way as soon as I came aboard. The Dutchman's shipment of copra was arranged for a week, 2, 3 weeks, as the wind allowed, and I was to return from the Lower Islands, where my present cargo was assigned, and take it on. As we stood off shore under the waxing moonlight, as I watched the island gathering itself in from either extremity grow small and smaller on the measureless glass of the sea, the whole episode seemed to swell up in my mind, explode, and vanish. It was too preposterous. 38 hours chosen at random out of 10,000 empty Polynesian years. That in the wink of eternity 5 human lives should have gone to pot simultaneously. A man wasn't to be taken in by that sort of thing. Through 12 days it remained at that. Discharging cargo in the furnace of Cocoa Inlet, if my thoughts went back to Taai, it was almost with the deprecating amusement a man will feel who has been had by a hoax. If those minstrel husbands were murdered and buried, if that Broadway imp sweated under the red-hot roof of the go-down, if that incomparable golden-skin heiress of cannibal emperors sat staring seaward from the gilded cage of the Dutchman, awaiting, no longer waiting, the whim of the epicure, if indeed any one of them all had ever so much as set foot upon that microscopic strand lost under the blue equator, then it was simply because some one had made it up in his head to while me away an empty hour. I give you my word, when at noon of the 13th day the mountain of Taai stood up once more beyond the bows, I was weary of the fantasy. I should have been amazed, really, to find a fellow named Signet housed in the Dutchman's private jail. As a matter of fact, Signet was not in the jail. When I went ashore in mid-afternoon, wondering a little why no naked biscuit beggars or gin swallowers had swum out to bother me that day, I found the trader of Taai sitting on his veranda, blowing puffs of smoke from those fine Manila Club perfectos out into the sunshine. Beside him leaned a shiny 12-gauge pump-gun, which he jostled with an elbow as he bade me by word and gesture to make myself at home. I'm quite certain I looked the fool. My eyes must have stuck out. Half a dozen times I started to speak. With some vacant, fatuous syllable I tried to break the ice. Strange as it sounds, I was never so embarrassed in my life. For the trader of Taai, the blatantly obvious proprietor of the island's industry and overlord of its destinies, sitting there before me now with a pump-gun touching his elbow, was this fellow Signet. Till now I don't know precisely what had happened. That is to say, none of the details of the act, horrid or heroic as they may have been. All I seemed to have was a memory of the Dutchman's voice. "Why do you not kill me? Ha, ha, ha! Then you could take my property." And again an echo of his disdainful laughter at that fool. Ha, ha, ha! As, on some midnight, he had kicked his dinner guest and his coolie cotton pants out into the rain. Why not, indeed? But who now was the fool? Signet, in the course of the afternoon, brought forth gravely a bill of sale, making over in an orderly fashion to B.R. Signet, New York, U.S.A., the real and personal property of the trading station at Taai, and signed, in the identical upright 14th Street Grammar School script, by the Dutchman. I understood Signet. Signet understood me. The thing was not even an attempt at forgery. It was something solely formal, so much as to say, this is understood to be the basis of our mutual dealings. You will see I am owner of this place. As for the Dutchman. Oh, the Dutchman, well, he decided to go away. Go home. Before the incalculable sang-froid of this rail-bird, movie usher, alley-dodger, and hanger-on at dancing academies, I could not so much as summon up the cheek to ask what he had done with the body. You'll say I ought to have acted, that I ought at least to have got up and left him. That shows two things. First, that you have never been a trader in the islands. Second, that you cannot at all comprehend how stunning he was. Sitting there a single fortnight removed from cotton pants and the beach, crime-stained, imperturbable, magnificent. Spawn of the white lights, emperor of an island. How's that? It's a rich island, he impressed upon me with an intention I was yet to plumb. Dole, he exclaimed, it's a gold mine. Is she here? I ventured to demand at last. Is she? Say, come and have a look. I was between laughing and wincing at that have a look. Going up the garden, Signet let me know that the woman was in love with him. I might believe it or not. She would do anything for him. Anything! He exclaimed, standing squarely still in the path, and in his eyes I was somehow relieved to find a trace of wonder. Obstacles! All his life had been turning back from small, insurmountable obstacles. Of a sudden he beheld really vast obstacles tumbling down, verily at a touch. There was just one more of them. By a lucky chance this queen-daughter did not know by whose hand she had been made thrice a widow. It was the simplest thing to suppose it the trader, the same big blonde European man who had presently removed her for safety to the summer-house behind the residence. And from the trader, by a gesture of melodramatic violence, the other and slighter man had set her free. Perhaps even that would not have intrigued her essentially barbaric interest as much as it did had it not been for his amazing attitude of, well, let's say, refrainment, his almost absurdly fastidious concern for what the West would call the sanctity of her person. You can imagine, to a Marquesan woman, that she was not ugly. As her gaze from the platform dwelt upon the shrewd, blade-sharp features of the man beside me, the elementary problem in her eyes seemed to redouble the peculiar golden Aryan beauty of her face. Let me tell you I am human. Perhaps Signet was human too. Standing there, encompassed by the light of that royal and lovely woman's eyes, there was surely about him a glow, and a glow not altogether, it seemed to me, of Smith's nickel and Jones's dime. I could have laughed. I could have kicked him. The impostor! Even yet I had failed to measure the man. Back on the veranda again, dinner eaten and dusk come down, Signet brought out an old guitar from among the Dutchman's effects. It had belonged probably to that defunct nephew of the dress-clothes, and as he talked he picked up the thing with idle fingers. Not altogether idle, though, I began to think. Something began to emerge by and by from the random fingerings, a rhythm, a tonal theme. Then I had it, and there seemed to stand before me again the swarded high place, with torches flaring over upturned faces and mounting walls of green. Almost I sensed again the beat in my blood, the eye-ravishing vision of that gold-brown flame of motion, that voluptuous priestess. "Oh, yes, that," I murmured. "It's got something, that tune. But how can you remember it?" "She helps me out. I'm trying to put it in shape." Indeed, when I left that night, and before my oarsman had got me a cable's length from the beach, I heard the strumming resumed, very faintly, up in the dark behind the residence. still tentatively, with, now and then, through the flawless hush of the night, the guiding note of a woman's voice, a woman profoundly mystified. A rehearsal? For what? For that almost mythical Broadway, half around the bulge of the world? Had the fool, then, not got beyond that? Yet? Here he was, lord of the daughter of a queen, proprietor of a gold mine. For Signet was not to be hoodwinked about the commercial value of Taai. All afternoon and evening, as through the 2 days following, while my promised cargo was getting ferried out under the shining authority of the pump-gun, he scarcely let a minute go by without some word or figure to impress upon me the extent of his possessions. To what end? Well, it all came out in a burst on the 3rd evening, my last there. He even followed me to the beach. Actually, regardless of the Dutchman's nephew's boots and trouser legs, he pursued me out into the shadows. A gold mine! Don't be a damned boob, Doll. You can see for yourself. A big proposition for a guy like you, with a ship and everything. Upon me he would heap all those priceless possessions. Me! And in exchange he would ask only cabin passage for 2 from Taai Beach to the Golden Gate. Only deck passage. Only anything. Set us down there, me and her, that's all. I'll give you a bill of sale. Why, from where you look at it, it's a find. It's a lead-pipe cinch. It's taking candy away from a baby, man. Why don't you keep it, then? The soul of his city showed through. I saw him again as I had seen him swimming in his cotton pants, with that low comedy whisker and that consuming little greedy nickel hope of paradise. Even the gestures. No, but can't you see, Doll? I got a bigger thing up my sleeve. God Almighty, do you think I'm a farmer? You could go big here. I don't go at all. I ain't that kind. But put me down in New York with that woman there, and that there dance, and that tune. Say, you don't understand. You can't imagine. Money? Say, and not only money. Say, I could take that up to Glauber's Academy, and I could say to Glauber, I could say. I had to leave him standing there, up to his knees in the inky water, heaping me frankly with curses. I shall not repeat the curses. At the end of them he bawled after me, "But I'll get out of here. You watch me all the same, you damn—" The reason I didn't put up anchor and get out that night was that, when I came aboard, I discovered not far from my berth the unobtrusive loom of that Dutch gunboat arrived for a look-in at last. The only thing for me to do was to sit tight. If, when the state of the island's affairs had been discovered, there should be want of explanation or corroboration, it would be altogether best for me to give it. I wasn't yet through trading in those waters, you understand. But Signet was no fool. He, too, must have seen the discreet shade of the visitor. When the morning dawned, neither he nor the royal dancer from the Marquesas was to be found. Some time in that night, from the windward beach, ill-manned and desperate, the royal sailing canoe must have set forth tumultuously upon its pilgrimage again. I sat in a place in Honolulu. Soft drinks were served, and somewhere beyond a tidy screen of palm fronds a band of strings was playing. Even with soft drinks, the old instinct of wanderers and lone men to herd together had put 4 of us down at the same table. 2 remain vague, a fattish holiday-making banker and a consumptive from Bar, Vermont. For reasons to appear, I recall the third more in detail. He let me know somewhere in the give and take of talk that he was a railway telegraph operator, and that, given his first long vacation on an old impulse, come down from the days of the Hawaiian hula phonograph records, had brought him to the Isle of Delight. He was disappointed in it. One could see in his candid eyes that he felt himself done out of an illusion of continuous dancing by girls in rope skirts on moonlit beaches. It was an intolerable waste of money. Here, come so far and so expensively to the romantic goal, he was disturbed to find his imagination fleeing back to the incredible adventure of a Rock Island station, an iron-red dot on the bold, high plain of eastern Colorado, to the blind sun-flare of the desert, to the immensity of loneliness, to the thundering nightly crisis of the 11:10 sweeping monstrous and one-eyed out of the cavern of the west, grating, halting, glittering, gossiping, yawning, drinking with a rush and gurgle from the red tank, and on again with an abrupt and always startling clangour into the remote night of the east. He shifted impatiently in his chair and made a dreary face at the screening fronds. "For the love o' Mike, even the rags they play here are old." The consumptive was telling the banker about the new co-operative scheme in Bar, Vermont. "For the love of Mike," my friend repeated. "That ain't a band, it's a historical society. Dead and buried. Next they'll strike up that latest novelty rage, 'In the Shade of the Old Apple Tree.' Now will you listen to that? Robbing the cemetery." He needn't have asked me to listen. As a matter of fact, I had been listening for perhaps 100 seconds. Listening, not as if with the ears, but with the deep sensatory nerves. And without consciously grasping what the air was, I had suffered an abrupt voyage through space. I saw a torch-lit sward, ringed with blue and saffron faces and high forest walls. I saw the half-nude golden loveliness of a Polynesian woman, shaken like a windy leaf. And the beat of a goat-hide drum was the beat of my blood. I felt my shoulders swaying. I looked at the young man. His face expressed a facetious weariness, but his shoulders, too, were swaying. "What tune is that?" I asked in a level tone. His contemptuous amazement was unfeigned. "Holy Moses, man, where you been?" He squinted at me. After all, I might be stringing him. "That," he said, "is as old as Adam. It was run to death so long ago I can't remember. That's Paragon Park. That is the old original first shimmy dance, with whiskers 2 foot long." "The original what?" "Shimmy! Shimmy! Say, honest to God, don't you know?" And with his shoulders he made a wriggling gesture in appeal to my wits, the crudest burlesque, it seemed, of a divinely abominable gesture in my memory. "That?" he queried. "Eh?" "Shimmy," I echoed, and my mind skipped back. "Shem dance. Shame dance. I see." "Why?" he demanded, intrigued by my preoccupation. "Nothing. It just reminded me of something." Then he lifted a hand and smote himself on the thigh. "Me too! By jinks! Say, I'd almost forgotten that." He hitched his chair upon me, held me down with a forefinger. "Listen, that was funny. It was one night last fall. It was just after number 17 had pulled out, westbound, about 1:40 in the morning. There wasn't anything else till 6:1. Them are always the hardest hours. A feller's got to stay awake, see, and nothing to keep him, unless maybe a coyote's howling a mile off, or maybe a bum knocking around among the box-cars on the siding, or, if it's cold, the stove to tend. That's all, unless you put a record on the old phonograph and hit her up a few minutes now and then. Dead? Say, boy, well, this night it was a bum. I'm sitting there in the coop counting my fingers and listening to Limon calling off car numbers to Denver. Just like that I'm sitting, when I hear something out in the waiting room, not very loud. Well, I go out there, and there's the bum, come right into the waiting room. Bum, if he wasn't the father and mother and brother and sister of the original bum, I'll eat my hat. Almost a Jew-looking guy, and he'd saw hard service, but he's got a kind of crazy glitter in his eye. "Well," says I, just like that, "well, what do you want?" He don't whine, he don't handle the pan. He's got that look in his eye. "My woman is out in them box-cars," says he. "I'm going to bring her in here where it's warm." That's what he says. Not can I bring her in, but going to bring her in. From a hobo. Can you imagine? It makes me think. It comes to me the guy is really off his trolley. To keep him calm, I says, "Well." He goes out. "I'm shed of him," I said to myself. Not a bit. About 3 minutes, and here he comes trotting back, sure enough, bringing a woman with him. Now, mister, what's your name? Prepare to laugh. That there woman, listen, make up your face, she's a nigger. He says she ain't a nigger. "Mexican?" says I. "No," says he. I give her another look, but I can't make much out of her, except she's some kind of a nigger anyhow. She's sitting on the bench far away from the light, and she's dressed in a second-hand horse blanket, a feed sack, and a brand new pair of arctics. and she don't say a word. Well, says I, if she ain't some kind of nigger, I'll eat my... But there he is, all of a sudden squaring off in front of me, his mug stuck up and his eyes like a couple of headlights. Imagine! The guy ain't got enough meat on his bones for a restaurant chicken. Honest to God, he looked like he'd been through a mile of sausage mill, but crazy as a bedbug, and there's something about a crazy man. "Hold your grab," says he. To me! That gets my goat. "Just for that," says I, "you can get out of this station, and don't forget to take your woman along with you. Get out." "Get out, hell," says he. He sticks his mug right in my face. "That woman you speak so light of," says he, "is a queen, a Canuck queen," say he. I had to laugh. Since when was there queens in Canada? And since when has the Canuck queen been using stove polish for talcum powder? The guy grabs me by the coat. Listen, he was strong as wire. He was deceiving, a wire with 10,000 volts into it. "Look at me," says he, breathing hard between his teeth, "and take care," says he. "I'm a man no man can monkey with. I'm a man that'll go through. I'm stained with crime. I've waded through seas of blood. Nothing in heaven or earth or hell can stop me. A month from now rubes like you'll be glad to crawl at my feet and wipe their dirty mugs on the hem of that there woman's skirt. Now listen," says he, "get the hell into that there box of yourn over there and be quiet." Crazy as a loon. I hoped to die. The guy was dangerous, I see that. It come to me it's best to humour him, and I go into the coop again. I sit there counting my fingers and listening to Denver telling back them car numbers to Limon again. By and by I'm jumpy as a cat. I get up and stick a record in the old machine. That's what brings the whole thing back to mind. That record is this Paragon Park. First thing I know, I'm out in the waiting room again, and what do you think I see? I'll give you 100 guesses. "I'll take one," I said to him. "What you saw was the finest exhibition of the shimmy you ever clapped an eye upon. Am I right?" The young fellow's mouth hung open. He stared at me. "Half undressed, honest, that nigger woman, horse blanket, feed sack, arctics, where was they? Shimmy, say, can you imagine, in that there prairie depot, at 3 in the morning, and a wind howling under the floor? Say, well, I can't tell you, but talk about shimmy. Say, she's like a dead one come to life." "Yes," I agreed, "yes. But what about the man?" "Well, that man now, the record's coming to the end, and I go back in to start it over. And here's this hobo come in behind me. "'What's that?' says he, pointing to the record I got in my hand. Then he grabs it and looks it over. He keeps turning it round and round and round, staring at it. "'I hope you'll know it again,' says I, with a laugh. My laugh seems to set him off into a shiver. Then down he throws that record of mine onto the floor and stamps on it, busts it into a million pieces under his boots. I been telling you. He's crazy. "'Here there!' I yell at him. He looks at me, looks right through me it seems, and beyond, with them there red-rimmed eyes. "'Seas of blood,' says he. 'That's all, seas of blood.' Then he turns around, walks out into the waiting room and sits down in a heap in the farthest corner. Never another peep. There he sits till daylight, and the nigger woman with the horse blanket on again. She sits there beside him, holding his hand. "'What's up with him?' I ask her. She says something in Mexican or some language anyhow, but I see she don't know any more'n me. It's just like this. The current's gone out of the wire. Last I ever seen of 'em, she's leading him off in the sunrise toward the box cars, leading him by the hand. Now did you ever hear a funnier experience than that to happen to a man?" "No," I said, "I never did." "You had to pity him," he added. "Yes," I agreed, and I could think of her leading him by the hand. I saw Signet again. It was on my first and last voyage to the Marquesas. Under the shadow of a mountain, on a stone platform facing the sea, sat Signet, quite nude save for a loincloth, and with an unequivocal black beard falling down on his breast. There was a calmness about him. "How did you come here?" I asked at length. "She wanted it," he said. "She's a wonderful woman," he said to me, "a wonderful woman. She would do anything for me, Dole, anything. We've got a kid." I made shift to get in a question I had carried long in my mind. Somebody beat you out at Papeete, then, after all." He turned upon me a faintly quizzical look. "I mean somebody saw her, some tourist, that time she danced at Papeete, remember, and got away with it." The thing seemed already so remote that he had to grope back. Then he laughed. "Lord, no. Look here, Dole. It was her herself seen the thing at Papeete, on board a tourist boat. I found out about it since I learned her language good. Her and some others went aboard to dance the hula, same as always, you know. Then some of them, the tourists, understand, well, they had to spring the latest thing from Broadway. And then this woman of mine, well, you can imagine, like a woman with a new hat, got to run right off and show it to the whole damn length and breadth of the South Seas, that's all. And once upon a time I thought I was bright." Out of the half-house at the rear of the platform came the daughter of a queen, bearing under one arm a prince of this island valley, and in the other hand a bowl of cocoanut wine for the visitor, and for her lord. And you will see that at last, despite the malignant thrusts and obstacles of destiny, this gutter-snipe of Gotham had come to a certain estate. When I left, he accompanied me slowly to the beach. "You ought to like it here," I said. "After all, the city could never have given you so much." "No," he said, wide-eyed. He took in the azure immensity of the sea. "No, here a guy has got time to think, without any hurry or worry. I've been thinking, Dole, a lot. I ain't going to say nothing about it, but, Dole, I believe I got an idea coming along. No flivver this time. A real, surefire hunch. Something that'll go big in the city. Big." And so I left him there in the shadow of the mountain, staring at the impassable sea. End of The Shame Dance by Wilbur Daniel Steele.
The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist by Arthur Conan Doyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Tomlinson, London, January 2017. From the years 1894 to 1901 inclusive, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was a very busy man. It is safe to say that there was no public case of any difficulty in which he was not consulted during those 8 years, and there were hundreds of private cases, some of them of the most intricate and extraordinary character, in which he played a prominent part. Many startling successes and a few unavoidable failures were the outcome of this long period of continuous work. As I have preserved very full notes of all these cases, and was myself personally engaged in many of them, it may be imagined that it is no easy task to know which I should select to lay before the public. I shall, however, preserve my former rule, and give the preference to those cases which derive their interest not so much from the brutality of the crime as from the ingenuity and dramatic quality of the solution. For this reason I will now lay before the reader the facts connected with Miss Violet Smith, the solitary cyclist of Charlington, and the curious sequel of our investigations, which culminated in unexpected tragedy. It is true that the circumstances did not admit of any striking illustration of those powers for which my friend was famous, but there were some points about the case which made it stand out in those long records of crime from which I gather the material for these little narratives. On referring to my notebook for the year 1895, I found that it was upon Saturday, the 23rd of April, that we first heard of Miss Violet Smith. Her visit was, I remember, extremely unwelcome to Holmes, for he was immersed at that moment in a very abstruse and complicated problem concerning the peculiar persecution to which John Vincent Harden, the well-known tobacco millionaire, had been subjected. My friend, who loved above all things precision and concentration of thought, resented anything which distracted his attention from the matter in hand. And yet, without a harshness which was foreign to his nature, it was impossible to refuse to listen to the story of the young and beautiful woman, tall, graceful, and queenly, who presented herself at Baker Street late in the evening and implored his assistance and advice. It was vain to urge that his time was already fully occupied, for the young lady had come with the determination to tell her story, and it was evident that nothing short of force could get her out of the room until she had done so. With a resigned air and a somewhat weary smile, Holmes begged the beautiful intruder to take a seat and to inform us what it was that was troubling her. "At least it cannot be your health," said he, as his keen eyes darted over her. "So ardent a bicyclist must be full of energy." She glanced down in surprise at her own feet, and I observed the slight roughening of the side of the sole caused by the friction of the edge of the pedal. "Yes, I bicycle a good deal, Mr. Holmes, and that has something to do with my visit to you today." My friend took the lady's ungloved hand and examined it with as close an attention and as little sentiment as a scientist would show to a specimen. "You will excuse me, I am sure. It is my business," said he as he dropped it. "I nearly fell into the error of supposing that you were typewriting. Of course, it is obvious that it is music. You observe the spatulate finger end, Watson, which is common to both professions. There is a spirituality about the face, however," he gently turned it towards the light, "which the typewriter does not generate. This lady is a musician." "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I teach music." "In the country, I presume, from your complexion?" "Yes, sir, near Farnham, on the borders of Surrey. A beautiful neighbourhood and full of the most interesting associations. You remember, Watson, that it was near there that we took Archie Stamford, the forger. Now, Miss Violet, what has happened to you near Farnham on the borders of Surrey?" The young lady, with great clearness and composure, made the following curious statement. "My father is dead, Mr. Holmes. He was James Smith, who conducted the orchestra at the old Imperial Theatre. My mother and I were left without a relation in the world except one uncle, Ralph Smith, who went to Africa 25 years ago, and we have never had a word from him since. When father died we were left very poor, but one day we were told that there was an advertisement in the Times inquiring for our whereabouts. You can imagine how excited we were, for we thought that someone had left us a fortune. We went at once to the lawyer whose name was given in the paper. There we met two gentlemen, Mr. Carruthers and Mr. Woodley, who were home on a visit from South Africa. They said that my uncle was a friend of theirs, and he died some months before in great poverty in Johannesburg, and that he had asked them with his last breath to hunt up his relations and see that they were in no want. It seemed strange to us that Uncle Ralph, who took no notice of us when he was alive, should be so careful to look after us when he was dead. But Mr. Carruthers explained that the reason was that my uncle had just heard of the death of his brother, and so felt responsible for our fate. "Excuse me," said Holmes. "When was this interview?" "Last December, 4 months ago." "Pray proceed." "Mr. Woodley seemed to me to be a most odious person. He was for ever making eyes at me, a coarse, puffy-faced, red-moustached young man, with his hair plastered down on each side of his forehead. I thought that he was perfectly hateful, and I was sure that Cyril would not wish me to know such a person." "Oh, Cyril is his name," said Holmes, smiling. The young lady blushed and laughed. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, Cyril Morton, an electrical engineer, and we hope to be married at the end of the summer. Dear me, how did I get talking about him? What I wished to say was that Mr. Woodley was perfectly odious, but that Mr. Carruthers, who was a much older man, was more agreeable. He was a dark, sallow, clean-shaven, silent person, but he had polite manners and a pleasant smile. He inquired how we were left, and on finding that we were very poor, he suggested that I should come and teach music to his only daughter, aged 10. I said that I did not like to leave my mother, on which he suggested that I should go home to her every week-end, and he offered me 100 a year, which was certainly splendid pay. So it ended by my accepting, and I went down to Chiltern Grange, about 6 miles from Farnham. Mr. Carruthers was a widower, but he had engaged a lady housekeeper, a very respectable elderly person called Mrs. Dixon, to look after his establishment. The child was a dear, and everything promised well. Mr. Carruthers was very kind and very musical, and we had most pleasant evenings together. Every week-end I went home to my mother in town. The first flaw in my happiness was the arrival of the red-moustached Mr. Woodley. He came for a visit of a week, and it seemed 3 months to me. He was a dreadful person, a bully to everyone else, but to me something infinitely worse. He made odious love to me, boasted of his wealth, said that if I married him I would have the finest diamonds in London, and finally, when I would have nothing to do with him, he seized me in his arms one day after dinner. He was hideously strong, and he swore that he would not let me go until I had kissed him. Mr. Carruthers came in and tore him off me, on which he turned upon his own host, knocking him down and cutting his face open. That was the end of his visit, as you can imagine. Mr. Carruthers apologized to me next day, and assured me that I should never be exposed to such an insult again. I have not seen Mr. Woodley since. And now, Mr. Holmes, I come to the last special thing which has caused me to ask your advice today. You must know that every Saturday forenoon I ride on my bicycle to Farnham Station in order to get the 12:22 to town. The road from Chiltern Grange is a lonely one, and at one spot it is particularly so, for it lies for over a mile between Charlington Heath upon one side and the woods which lie around Charlington Hall upon the other. You could not find a more lonely tract of road anywhere, and it is quite rare to meet so much as a cart or a peasant until you reach the high road near Crooksbury Hill. 2 weeks ago I was passing this place when I chanced to look back over my shoulder, and about 200 yards behind me I saw a man, also on a bicycle. He seemed to be a middle-aged man with a short, dark beard. I looked back before I reached Farnham, but the man was gone, so I thought no more about it. But you can imagine how surprised I was, Mr. Holmes, when on my return on the Monday I saw the same man on the same stretch of road. My astonishment was increased when the incident occurred again, exactly as before, on the following Saturday and Monday. He always kept his distance and did not molest me in any way, but still it certainly was very odd. I mentioned it to Mr. Carruthers, who seemed interested in what I said, and told me that he had ordered a horse and trap so that in future I should not pass over these lonely roads without some companion. The horse and trap were to have come this week, but for some reason they were not delivered, and again I had to cycle to the station. That was this morning. You can think that I looked out when I came to Charlington Heath, and there, sure enough, was the man, exactly as he had been the 2 weeks before. He always kept so far from me that I could not clearly see his face, but it was certainly someone whom I did not know. He was dressed in a dark suit with a cloth cap. The only thing about his face that I could clearly see was his dark beard. Today I was not alarmed, but I was filled with curiosity, and I determined to find out who he was and what he wanted. I slowed down my machine, but he slowed down his. Then I stopped altogether, and he stopped also. Then I laid a trap for him. There was a sharp turning of the road, and I pedalled very quickly round this, and then I stopped and waited. I expected him to shoot round and pass me before he could stop, but he never appeared. Then I went back and looked round the corner. I could see a mile of road, but he was not on it. To make it more extraordinary, there was no side road at this point down which he could have gone. Holmes chuckled and rubbed his hands. "This case certainly presents some features of its own," said he. "How much time elapsed between your turning the corner and your discovery that the road was clear?" 2 or 3 minutes. "Then he could not have retreated down the road, and you say that there was no side roads?" "None." "Then he certainly took a footpath on one side or the other." "It could not have been on the side of the heath, or I should have seen him." So, by the process of exclusion, we arrive at the fact that he made his way towards Charlington Hall, which, as I understand, is situated in its own grounds on one side of the road. Anything else?" "Nothing, Mr. Holmes. save that I was so perplexed that I felt I should not be happy until I had seen you and had your advice." Holmes sat in silence for some little time. "Where is the gentleman to whom you are engaged?" he asked at last. "He is in the Midland Electrical Company at Coventry." "He would not pay you a surprise visit." "Oh, Mr. Holmes, as if I should not know him." "Have you had any other admirers?" "Several before I knew Cyril." "And since?" "There was this dreadful man, Woodley, if you can call him an admirer." "No one else?" Our fair client seemed a little confused. "Who was he?" asked Holmes. "Oh, it may be a mere fancy of mine, but it has seemed to me sometimes that my employer, Mr. Carruthers, takes a great deal of interest in me. We are thrown rather together. I play his accompaniments in the evening. He has never said anything. He is a perfect gentleman, but a girl always knows." "Ah!" Holmes looked grave. "What does he do for a living?" "He is a rich man." "No carriages or horses?" "Well, at least he is fairly well to do, but he goes into the city 2 or 3 times a week. He is deeply interested in South African gold shares." "You will let me know any fresh development, Miss Smith. I am very busy just now, but I will find time to make some inquiries into your case. In the meantime, take no step without letting me know. Good-bye, and I trust that we shall have nothing but good news from you." "It is a part of the settled order of nature that such a girl should have followers," said Holmes, as he pulled at his meditative pipe. "But for choice, not on bicycles, in lonely country roads. Some secretive lover beyond all doubt. But there are curious and suggestive details about the case, Watson." "That he should appear only at that point." "Exactly. Our first effort must be to find who are the tenants of Charlington Hall. Then again, how about the connections between Carruthers and Woodley, since they appear to be men of such a different type? How come they both to be so keen upon looking up Ralph Smith's relations? One more point. What sort of a menage is it which pays double the market price for a governess, but does not keep a horse, although 6 miles from the station? Odd, Watson, very odd." "You will go down?" "No, my dear fellow, you will go down. This may be some trifling intrigue, and I cannot break my other important research for the sake of it. On Monday you will arrive early at Farnham. You will conceal yourself near Charlington Heath, and you will observe these facts for yourself, and act as your own judgment advises. Then, having inquired as to the occupants of the hall, you will come back to me and report. And now, Watson, not another word of the matter until we have a few solid stepping-stones on which we may hope to get across to our solution." We had ascertained from the lady that she went down upon the Monday by train which leaves Waterloo at 9:50. So I started early and caught the 9:13. At Farnham Station I had no difficulty in being directed to Charlington Heath. It was impossible to mistake the scene of the young lady's adventure, for the road runs between the open heath on one side and an old yew hedge upon the other, surrounding a park which is studded with magnificent trees. There was a main gateway of lichen-studded stone, each side pillar surmounted by mouldering heraldic emblems. But besides this central carriage drive, I observed several points where there were gaps in the hedge and paths leading through them. The house was invisible from the road, but the surroundings all spoke of gloom and decay. The heath was covered with golden patches of flowering gorse, gleaming magnificently in the light of the bright spring sunshine. Behind one of these clumps I took up my position so as to command both the gateway of the hall and a long stretch of the road upon either side. It had been deserted when I left it, but now I saw a cyclist riding down it from the opposite direction to that in which I had come. He was clad in a dark suit, and I saw that he had a black beard. On reaching the end of the Charlington grounds, he sprang from his machine and led it through a gap in the hedge, disappearing from my view. A quarter of an hour passed, and then a second cyclist appeared. This time it was the young lady coming from the station. I saw her look about her as she came to the Charlington hedge, An instant later the man emerged from his hiding place, sprang upon his cycle, and followed her. In all the broad landscape those were the only moving figures, the graceful girl sitting very straight upon her machine, and the man behind her bending low over his handlebar with a curiously furtive suggestion in every movement. She looked back at him and slowed her pace. He slowed also. She stopped. He at once stopped too, keeping 200 yards behind her. Her next movement was as unexpected as it was spirited. She suddenly whisked her wheels around and dashed straight at him. He was as quick as she, however, and darted off in desperate flight. Presently she came back up the road again, her head haughtily in the air, not deigning to take any further notice of her silent attendant. He had turned also, and still kept his distance until the curve of the road hid them from my sight. I remained in my hiding place, and it was well that I did so, for presently the man reappeared, cycling slowly back. He turned in at the hall gates and dismounted from his machine. For some few minutes I could see him standing among the trees. His hands were raised, and he seemed to be settling his necktie. Then he mounted his cycle and rode away from me down the drive towards the hall. I ran across the heath and peered through the trees. Far away I could catch glimpses of the old grey building with its bristling Tudor chimneys, but the drive ran through a dense shrubbery, and I saw no more of my man. However, it seemed to me that I had done a fairly good morning's work, and I walked back in high spirits to Farnham. The local house agent could tell me nothing about Charlington Hall, and referred me to a well-known firm in Pall Mall. There I halted on my way home, and met with courtesy from the representative. No, I could not have Charlington Hall for the summer. I was just too late. It had been let about a month ago. Mr. Williamson was the name of the tenant. He was a respectable elderly gentleman. The polite agent was afraid he could say no more, as the affairs of his clients were not matters which he could discuss. Mr. Sherlock Holmes listened with attention to the long report which I was able to present to him that evening, but it did not elicit that word of curt praise which I had hoped for and should have valued. On the contrary, his austere face was even more severe than usual as he commented upon the things that I had done and the things I had not. "Your hiding place, my dear Watson, was very faulty. You should have been behind the hedge. Then you would have had a close view of this interesting person. As it is, you were some hundreds of yards away, and can tell me even less than Miss Smith. She thinks she does not know the man. I am convinced she does. Why otherwise should he be so desperately anxious that she should not get so near him as to see his features? You describe him as bending over the handlebar. Concealment again, you see. You really have done remarkably badly. He returns to the house, and you want to find out who he is. You come to a London house agent." "What should I have done?" I cried with some heat. "Gone to the nearest public house. That is the centre of country gossip. They would have told you every name, from the master to the scullery maid. Williamson, it conveys nothing to my mind. If he is an elderly man, he is not this active cyclist who sprints away from that athletic young lady's pursuit. What have we gained by your expedition? The knowledge that the girl's story is true. I never doubted it. That there is a connection between the cyclist and the Hall. I never doubted that either. That the Hall is tenanted by Williamson. Who's the better for that? Well, well, my dear sir, don't look so depressed. We can do little more until next Saturday, and in the meantime I may make one or two inquiries myself." Next morning we had a note from Miss Smith, recounting shortly and accurately the very incidents which I had seen, but the pith of the letter lay in the postscript. "I am sure that you will respect my confidence, Mr. Holmes, when I tell you that my place here has become difficult owing to the fact that my employer has proposed marriage to me. I am convinced that his feelings are most deep and most honourable. At the same time my promise is, of course, given. He took my refusal very seriously, but also very gently. You can understand, however, that the situation is a little strained." "Our young friend seems to be getting into deep waters," said Holmes, thoughtfully, as he finished the letter. "The case certainly presents more features of interest and more possibility of development than I had originally thought. I should be none the worse for a quiet, peaceful day in the country and I'm inclined to run down this afternoon and test one or two theories which I have formed." Holmes's quiet day in the country had a singular termination, for he arrived at Baker Street late in the evening with a cut lip and a discoloured lump upon his forehead, besides a general air of dissipation which should have made his own person the fitting object of a Scotland Yard investigation. He was immensely tickled by his own adventures and laughed heartily as he recounted them. "I get so little active exercise that is always a treat," said he. "You are aware that I have some proficiency in the good old British sport of boxing. Occasionally it is of service. Today, for example, I should have come to very ignominious grief without it." I begged him to tell me what had occurred. "I found that country pub which I had already recommended to your notice, and there I made my discreet inquiries. I was in the bar, and a garrulous landlord was giving me all that I wanted. Williamson is a white-bearded man, and he lives alone with a small staff of servants at the Hall. There is some rumour that he is, or has been, a clergyman, but one or two incidents of his short residence at the Hall struck me as peculiarly unecclesiastical. I have already made some inquiries at a clerical agency, and they tell me there was a man of that name in orders, whose career has been a singularly dark one. Further inform me that there are usually week-end visitors, a warm lot, sir, at the Hall, and especially one gentleman with a red moustache, Mr. Woodley by name, who was always there. We had got as far as this when who should walk in but the gentleman himself, who had been drinking his beer in the tap-room and who had heard the whole conversation. Who was I? What did I want? What did I mean by asking questions? He had a fine flow of language, and his adjectives were very vigorous. He ended a string of abuse by a vicious backhander which I failed to entirely avoid. The next few minutes were delicious. It was a straight left against a slogging ruffian. I emerged as you see me. Mr. Woodley went home in a cart. So ended my country trip, and it must be confessed that, however enjoyable, my day on the Surrey board has not been much more profitable than your own. The Thursday brought us another letter from our client. "You will not be surprised, Mr. Holmes," said she, "to hear that I am leaving Mr. Carruthers' employment. Even the high pay cannot reconcile me to the discomforts of my situation. On Saturday I come up to town, and I do not intend to return. Mr. Carruthers has got a trap, and so the dangers of the lonely road, if there ever were any dangers, are now over. As to the special cause of my leaving, it is not merely the strained situation with Mr. Carruthers, but it is the reappearance of that odious man, Mr. Woodley. He was always hideous, but he looks more awful than ever now, for he appears to have had an accident, and he is much disfigured. I saw him out of the window, but I am glad to say I did not meet him. He had a long talk with Mr. Carruthers, who seemed much excited afterwards. Woodley must be staying in the neighbourhood, for he did not sleep here, and yet I caught a glimpse of him again this morning, slinking about in the shrubbery. I would sooner have a savage wild animal loose about the place. I loathe and fear him more than I can say. How can Mr. Carruthers endure such a creature for a moment? However, all my troubles will be over on Saturday." "So I trust, Watson, so I trust," said Holmes gravely. "There is some deep intrigue going on around that little woman, and it is our duty to see that no one molests her upon that last journey. I think, Watson, that we must spare time to run down together on Saturday morning and make sure that this curious and inconclusive investigation has no untoward ending." I confess that I had not up to now taken a very serious view of the case, which had seemed to me rather grotesque and bizarre than dangerous. That a man should lie in wait for and follow a very handsome woman is no unheard of thing, and if he had so little audacity that he not only dared not address her, but even fled from her approach, he was not a very formidable assailant. The ruffian Woodley was a very different person, but, except on one occasion, he had not molested our client, and now he visited the house of Carruthers without intruding upon her presence. The man on the bicycle was doubtless a member of those week-end parties at the Hall of which the publican had spoken, but who he was or what he wanted was as obscure as ever. It was the severity of Holmes's manner and the fact that he slipped a revolver into his pocket before leaving our rooms which impressed me with the feeling that tragedy might prove to lurk behind the curious train of events. A rainy night had been followed by a glorious morning, and the heath-covered countryside with the glowing clumps of flowering gorse seemed all the more beautiful to the eyes which were weary of the duns and drabs and slate greys of London. Holmes and I walked along the broad, sandy road, inhaling the fresh morning air and rejoicing in the music of the birds and the fresh breath of the spring. From a rise of the road on the shoulder of Crookbury Hill we could see the grim Hall bristling out from amidst the ancient oaks, which, old as they were still younger than the building which they surrounded. Holmes pointed along the long tract of road which wound, a reddish-yellow band, between the brown of the heath and the budding green of the woods. Far away, a black dot, we could see a vehicle moving in our direction. Holmes gave an exclamation of impatience. "I had given a margin of half an hour," said he. "If that is her trap, she must be making for the earlier train. I fear, Watson, that she will be past Charlington before we can possibly meet her." From the instant that we passed the rise, we could no longer see the vehicle, but we hastened onwards at such a pace that my sedentary life began to tell upon me, and I was compelled to fall behind. Holmes, however, was always in training, for he had inexhaustible stores of nervous energy upon which to draw. His springy step never slowed until suddenly, when he was 100 yards in front of me, he halted, and I saw him throw up his hand with a gesture of grief and despair. At the same instant an empty dog-cart, the horse cantering, the reins trailing, appeared round the curve of the road and rattled swiftly towards us. "Too late, Watson, too late!" cried Holmes, as I ran panting to his side. "Fool that I was not to allow for that earlier train. It's abduction, Watson, abduction, murder, heaven knows what. Block the road, stop the horse. That's right. Now jump in, and let us see if I can repair the consequences of my own blunder." We had sprung into the dog-cart, and Holmes, after turning the horse, gave a sharp cut with the whip, and we flew back along the road. As we turned the curve, the whole stretch of the road between the Hall and the heath was opened up. I grasped Holmes's arm. "That's the man!" I gasped. A solitary cyclist was coming towards us. His head was down and his shoulders rounded as he put every ounce of energy that he possessed onto the pedals. He was flying like a racer. Suddenly he raised his bearded face, saw us close to him, and pulled up, springing from his machine. The coal-black beard was in singular contrast to the pallor of his face, and his eyes were as bright as if he had a fever. He stared at us and at the dog-cart. Then a look of amazement came over his face. "Halloa! Stop there!" he shouted, holding his bicycle to block the road. "Where did you get that dog-cart? Pull up, man!" he yelled, drawing a pistol from his side pocket. "Pull up, I say, or by George, I'll put a bullet into your horse." Holmes threw the reins into my lap and sprang down from the cart. "You're the man we want to see. Where is Miss Violet Smith?" he said in his quick, clear way. "That's what I'm asking you. You're in her dog-cart. You ought to know where she is." "We met the dog-cart on the road. There was no one in it. We drove back to help the young lady." Good Lord, what shall I do?" cried the stranger in an ecstasy of despair. "They've got her, that hell-bound Woodley, and the blackguard parson. Come, man, come. If you really are her friend, stand by me and we'll save her if I have to leave my carcass in Charlington Wood." He ran distractedly, his pistol in his hand, towards a gap in the hedge. Holmes followed him, and I, leaving the horse grazing beside the road, followed Holmes. "This is where they came through," said he, pointing to the marks of several feet upon the muddy path. "Halloa, stop a minute. Who's this in the bush?" It was a young fellow about 17, dressed like an ostler, with leather cords and gaiters. He lay upon his back, his knees drawn up, a terrible cut upon his head. He was insensible, but alive. A glance at his wound told me that it had not penetrated the bone. "That's Peter the groom," cried the stranger. "He drove her. The beasts have pulled him off and clubbed him. Let him lie. We can't do him any good, but we may save her from the worst fate that can befall a woman." We ran frantically down the path which wound among the trees. We had reached the shrubbery which surrounded the house when Holmes pulled up. "They didn't go to the house. Here are their marks on the left. Here, beside the laurel bushes. Ah, I said so." As he spoke, a woman's shrill scream, a scream which vibrated with a frenzy of horror, burst from the thick green clump of bushes in front of us. It ended suddenly on its highest note with a choke and a gurgle. This way, they are in the bowling alley," cried the stranger, darting through the bushes. "Ah, the cowardly dogs! Follow me, gentlemen. Too late, too late. By the living Jingo." We had broken suddenly into a lovely glade of greenwood surrounded by ancient trees. On the farther side of it, under the shadow of a mighty oak, there stood a singular group of three people. One was a woman, our client, drooping and faint, a handkerchief round her mouth. Opposite her stood a brutal, heavy-faced, red-moustached young man, his gaitered legs parted wide, one arm akimbo, the other waving a riding crop, his whole attitude suggestive of a triumphant bravado. Between them an elderly, grey-bearded man wearing a short surplice over a light tweed suit had evidently just completed the wedding service, for he pocketed his prayer book as we appeared, and slapped the sinister bridegroom upon the back in jovial congratulation. "They're married," I gasped. "Come on," cried our guide, "come on." He rushed across the glade, Holmes and I at his heels. As we approached, the lady staggered against the trunk of the tree for support. Williamson, the ex-clergyman, bowed to us with mock politeness, and the bully Woodley advanced with a shout of brutal and exultant laughter. "You can take your beard off, Bob," said he. "I know you right enough. Well, you and your pals have just come in time for me to be able to introduce you to Mrs. Woodley." Our guide's answer was a singular one. He snatched off the dark beard which had disguised him and threw it to the ground, disclosing a long, sallow, clean-shaven face below it. Then he raised his revolver and covered the young ruffian, who was advancing upon him with his dangerous riding crop swinging from his hand. "Yes," said our ally, "I am Bob Carruthers, and I'll see this woman righted if I have to swing for it. I told you what I'd do if you molested her, and, by the Lord, I'll be as good as my word." "You're too late. She's my wife." "No, she's your widow." His revolver cracked, and I saw the blood spurt from the front of Woodley's waistcoat. He spun round with a scream and fell upon his back, his hideous red face turning suddenly to a dreadful mottled pallor. The old man, still clad in his surplice, burst into such a string of foul oaths as I have never heard, and pulled out a revolver of his own. But before he could raise it, he was looking down the barrel of Holmes' weapon. "Enough of this," said my friend coldly. "Drop that pistol. Watson, pick it up. Hold it to his head. Thank you. You, Carruthers, give me that revolver. We'll have no more violence. Come on, hand it over. Who are you, then?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes." "Good Lord!" "You have heard of me, I see." "I will represent the official police until they arrive. Here, you!" he shouted to a frightened groom who had appeared at the edge of the glade. "Come here, take this note as hard as you can ride to Farnham." He scribbled a few words upon a leaf from his notebook. "Give it to the superintendent at the police station. Until he comes I must detain you all under my personal custody." The strong, masterful personality of Holmes dominated the tragic scene, and all were equally puppets in his hands. Williamson and Carruthers found themselves carrying the wounded Woodley into the house, and I gave my arm to the frightened girl. The injured man was laid on his bed, and at Holmes's request I examined him. I carried my report to where he sat in the old tapestry-hung dining-room with his two prisoners before him. "He will live," said I. "What?" said Carruthers, springing out of his chair. "I'll go upstairs and finish him first. Do you tell me that girl, that angel, is to be tied to Roaring Jack Woodley for life?" "You need not concern yourself about that," said Holmes. "There are two very good reasons why she should under no circumstances be his wife. In the first place, we are very safe in questioning Mr. Williamson's right to solemnize a marriage." "I have been ordained," cried the old rascal, "and also unfrocked." Once a clergyman, always a clergyman. I think not. How about the licence? We had a licence for the marriage. I have it here in my pocket. Then you got it by a trick. But in any case, a forced marriage is no marriage, but it is a very serious felony, as you will discover before you have finished. You'll have time to think that point out during the next 10 years or so, unless I am mistaken. As to you, Carruthers, you would have done better to keep your pistol in your pocket. I begin to think so, Mr. Holmes, but when I thought of all the precaution I had taken to shield this girl, for I loved her, Mr. Holmes, and it is the only time that ever I knew what love was, it fairly drove me mad to think that she was in the power of the greatest brute and bully in South Africa, a man whose name is a holy terror from Kimberley to Johannesburg. Why, Mr. Holmes, you'll hardly believe it, but ever since that girl has been in my employment, I never once let her go past this house, where I knew these rascals were lurking, without following her on my bicycle, just to see that she came to no harm. I kept my distance from her, and I wore a beard so that she should not recognize me, for she is a good and high-spirited girl, and she wouldn't have stayed in my employment long if she had thought I was following her about the country roads. Why didn't you tell her of her danger? Because then again she would have left me, and I couldn't bear to face that. Even if she couldn't love me, it was a great deal to me just to see her dainty form about the house and to hear the sound of her voice. "Well," said I, "you call that love, Mr. Carruthers, but I should call it selfishness." Maybe the two things go together. Anyhow, I couldn't let her go. Besides, with this crowd about, it was well that she should have someone near to look after her. Then when the cable came, I knew they were bound to make a move. "What cable?" Carruthers took a telegram from his pocket. "That's it," said he. It was short and concise. "The old man is dead." Said Holmes. "I think I see how things worked, and I can understand how this message would, as you say, bring them to a head. But while we wait, you might tell me what you can." The old reprobate with the surplice burst into a volley of bad language. "By heaven," said he, "if you squeal on us, Bob Carruthers, I'll serve you as you served Jack Woodley. You can bleat about the girl to your heart's content, for that's your own affair. But if you round on your pals to this plain-clothes copper, it will be the worst day's work that you ever did." "Your reverence need not be excited," said Holmes, lighting a cigarette. "The case is clear enough against you, and all I ask is a few details for my private curiosity. However, if there's any difficulty in your telling me, I'll do the talking, and then you will see how far you have a chance of holding back your secrets. In the first place, 3 of you came from South Africa on this game. You, Williamson, you, Carruthers, and Woodley." "Lie number 1," said the old man. "I never saw either of them until 2 months ago, and I had never been in Africa in my life, so you can put all that in your pipe and smoke it, Mr. Busybody Holmes." "What he says is true," said Carruthers. Well, 2 of you came over. His reverence is our own home-made article. You had known Ralph Smith in South Africa. You had a reason to believe he would not live long. You found out that his niece would inherit his fortune. How's that, eh?" Carruthers nodded and Williamson swore. "She was next of kin, no doubt, and you were aware that the old fellow would make no will." "Couldn't read or write," said Carruthers. "So you came over, the 2 of you, and hunted up the girl. The idea was that one of you was to marry her and the other have a share of the plunder. For some reason Woodley was chosen as the husband. Why was that?" "We played cards for her on the voyage. He won." "I see. You got the young lady into your service, and there Woodley was to do the courting. She recognized the drunken brute that he was, and would have nothing to do with him. Meanwhile, your arrangement was rather upset by the fact that you had yourself fallen in love with the lady. You could no longer bear the idea of this ruffian owning her." "No, by George, I couldn't." "There was a quarrel between you. He left you in a rage and began to make his own plans independently of you." "It strikes me, Williamson, there isn't very much that we can tell this gentleman," cried Carruthers, with a bitter laugh. "Yes, we quarrelled, and he knocked me down. I am level with him on that, anyhow. Then I lost sight of him. That was when he picked up with this cast padre here. I found that they had set up housekeeping together at this place on the line that she had to pass for the station. I kept my eye on her after that, for I knew there was some devilry in the wind. I saw them from time to time, for I was anxious to know what they were after. 2 days ago Woodley came up to my house with this cable, which showed that Ralph Smith was dead. He asked me if I would stand by the bargain, and I said I would not. He asked me if I would marry the girl myself and give him a share. I said I would willingly do so, but that she would not have me. He said, let us get her married first, and after a week or two she may see things a bit different. I said I would have nothing to do with violence. So he went off cursing, like the foul-mouthed blackguard that he was, and swearing that he would have her yet. She was leaving me this weekend, and I had got a trap to take her to the station, but I was so uneasy in my mind that I followed her on my bicycle. She had got a start, however, and before I could catch her, the mischief was done. The first thing I knew about it was when I saw you two gentlemen driving back in her dog-cart. Holmes rose and tossed the end of his cigarette into the grate. "I have been very obtuse, Watson," said he. "When in your report you said that you had seen the cyclist, as you thought, arrange his necktie in the shrubbery, that alone should have told me all. However, we may congratulate ourselves upon a curious and, in some respects, a unique case. I perceive 3 of the county constabulary in the drive, and I am glad to see that the little ostler is able to keep pace with them. So it is unlikely that neither he nor the interesting bridegroom will be permanently damaged by their morning's adventures. I think, Watson, that in your medical capacity you might wait upon Miss Smith and tell her that if she is sufficiently recovered, we shall be happy to escort her to her mother's home. If she is not quite convalescent, you will find that a hint that we were about to telegraph to a young electrician in the Midlands would probably complete the cure. As to you, Mr. Crawdads, I think that you have done what you could to make amends for your share in an evil plot. There is my card, sir, and if my evidence can be of help to you in your trial, it shall be at your disposal. In the whirl of our incessant activity, it has often been difficult for me, as the reader has probably observed, to round off my narratives and to give those final details which the curious might expect. Each case has been the prelude to another, and the crisis once over, the actors have passed for ever out of our busy lives. I find, however, a short note at the end of my manuscripts dealing with this case, in which I have put it upon record that Miss Violet Smith did indeed inherit a large fortune, and that she is now the wife of Cyril Morton, the senior partner of Morton and Kennedy, the famous Westminster electricians. Williamson and Woodley were both tried for abduction and assault, the former getting 7 years and the latter 10. Of the fate of Crawdads I have no record, but I am sure that his assault was not viewed very gravely by the court, since Woodley had the reputation of being a most dangerous ruffian, and I think that a few months were sufficient to satisfy the demands of justice. End of The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist by Arthur Conan Doyle.